Sometimes the bravest thing a father can do isn't staying where he's needed. It's walking away before he's forced to betray what he knows is right. Before we begin, tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are right now. There's something special about knowing how far these stories travel, and tonight's story deserves to travel a long way. On the 31st floor of Aegis Dynamics headquarters, nobody expected silence to become the loudest sound in the room. The conference table stretched nearly 40 feet beneath polished lights, surrounded by executives whose tailored suits reflected confidence that had taken decades to build. At the far end of the room, Victoria Langford stood with both hands resting against the edge of the table, her voice calm, measured, and unmistakably final. "Do as I said or quit, Mr. Reed." No one looked at Malcolm immediately. They looked at Victoria instead, waiting for the inevitable surrender that always followed an ultimatum from the company's new CEO. Malcolm Reed simply lowered his eyes to the document in front of him. The signature line waited patiently beneath a safety certification that his name would make official. He read the final sentence one more time, then quietly slid the paper back across the table without touching the pen beside it. A faint breath escaped somewhere near the windows. Someone shifted in a leather chair. Graham Pierce, the company's chief operating officer, folded his arms with the tiny smile of a man convinced the next move had already been decided. Malcolm said nothing. Instead, he reached beneath the conference table and lifted a small cardboard box that looked surprisingly worn for something that had clearly been folded only hours earlier. A photograph of a smiling 10-year-old girl disappeared into it first. Then came a black notebook with frayed corners, a ceramic coffee mug with a faded blue stripe, an employee badge hanging from a plain black lanyard, and finally a small metal model of an airplane that had rested beside his laptop for years. Every movement was slow, careful, almost peaceful. Nobody interrupted him because nobody understood what they were watching. Elena Brooks stared across the table, unable to hide the confusion in her face. "Malcolm," she whispered, barely louder than the air conditioning. He looked at her with the same quiet expression he carried through every difficult meeting. "She gave me a choice," he answered softly. "I'm respecting it." Graham let out a short laugh that sounded more relieved than amused. "You're making a mistake," he said. Malcolm closed the lid of the box. "Maybe." He stood, slipped his chair neatly beneath the table, and picked up a plain white envelope that had been resting beside his notebook the entire meeting. Without looking at Graham, he placed the envelope directly in front of Victoria. Across the front, written in careful block letters, were only 8 words. "Open this when Graham blames everything on me." Victoria frowned. "What exactly is this?" Malcolm met her eyes for the first time since entering the room. "Hopefully something you'll never need." He turned toward the conference room door. No speeches, no anger, no threats, just the quiet footsteps of a man carrying the few things that mattered most. The executives watched the door close behind him, convinced they had just seen an employee throw away the best career of his life. None of them noticed the status monitor mounted on the wall until a soft electronic chime echoed through the room. The green indicator beside the company's flagship Sentinel system flickered once, then slowly changed to yellow. 6 days earlier, Malcolm Reed arrived at Aegis Dynamics before sunrise, just as he had for nearly 12 years. The parking garage was still half empty when he stepped out of his pickup truck carrying a travel mug of black coffee and a worn leather backpack that had seen better days. Inside the building, the security guard greeted him with the same smile every morning. Malcolm smiled back, scanned his badge, and disappeared into the quiet hallways while most of the city was still asleep. By the time the first engineers arrived after 8 o'clock, Malcolm had already reviewed overnight system reports, corrected 2 minor software anomalies, answered a dozen technical messages, and documented 3 recommendations for the Sentinel platform. None of those tasks appeared on executive dashboards. Nobody applauded when invisible problems never became visible. That was simply how Malcolm believed good engineering worked. At exactly 5 o'clock every afternoon, however, another pattern always attracted attention. While many employees stayed late with laptops open and conference room lights glowing, Malcolm shut down his workstation, organized every document on his desk, and walked toward the elevator without hesitation. Some whispered that he lacked ambition. Others joked that he had found the secret to doing less work than everyone else. The truth was that nobody followed him after he left the building. 22 minutes later, he parked outside Jefferson Elementary School, where one cheerful 10-year-old girl waited near the front entrance with a backpack nearly as large as she was. The moment Lila Reed spotted her father, her entire face lit up. She climbed into the truck and immediately began talking about science class, her robotics project, and the small electric motor that refused to cooperate. Malcolm listened to every word as though nothing else in the world mattered. They stopped at a neighborhood grocery store before heading home, debating whether homemade chili needed more beans or more peppers, laughing over the kind of ordinary conversations that quietly become lifelong memories. After dinner, Malcolm helped Lila rebuild the tiny robotic arm she had designed for the upcoming state competition. Whenever she became frustrated, he never reached for the screwdriver himself. Instead, he asked questions until she found the answer on her own. Machines tell the truth if you are patient enough to listen, he often reminded her. People should too. Once Lila was asleep, the lights inside the small house did not stay off for long. Around 9:30, Malcolm reopened his laptop at the kitchen table and logged back into the company network. For the next several hours, he reviewed code, monitored system performance, and responded to technical emergencies that most executives never even knew had happened. His work often continued until after midnight, but because nobody saw those hours, they did not exist in the stories people told about him at the office. Victoria Langford had been chief executive officer for less than 3 months, and every report she received seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. Malcolm Reed always left before everyone else. Graham Pierce never corrected that impression. In fact, he quietly encouraged it whenever the opportunity appeared. During one executive briefing, he casually remarked, "Brilliant engineer. Difficult to manage. He is not exactly committed to the pace we need anymore." Victoria glanced through Malcolm's personnel file, noticing years of exceptional performance reviews that seemed strangely inconsistent with the image now forming in front of her. She closed the folder without another question. Meanwhile, in the engineering department below, Malcolm stared at a stream of system data flowing across 3 monitors. Something about the newest Sentinel update did not feel right. The numbers were clean. Too clean. Experience had taught him that perfect data often deserved the most suspicion. He leaned closer to the screen, unaware that a quiet decision made in that moment would soon place everything he valued on a collision course with people who believed they already knew exactly who he was. Malcolm remained in front of his monitors long after the rest of the engineering floor had emptied for lunch. 3 different streams of diagnostic data rolled across the screens in steady rhythm, each confirming what every automated report insisted was true. Sentinel was performing flawlessly. Response times were perfect. Synchronization was perfect. Error rates were almost non-existent. Yet the more perfect the numbers appeared, the less Malcolm trusted them. During more than a decade of maintaining one of the most sophisticated aviation support platforms in the country, he had learned that real systems always carried small imperfections. Tiny fluctuations were signs of healthy complexity. Absolute perfection often meant someone had carefully decided what everyone else was allowed to see. He quietly opened archived system logs from 2 weeks earlier and began comparing thousands of lines of code one section at a time. Nearly 40 minutes later, a single modification caught his attention. It was only a few lines buried beneath layers of routine updates, almost invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. At first glance, it resembled an optimization patch designed to improve communication between remote servers. But the deeper Malcolm examined it, the more questions surfaced. The new instructions created a hidden path capable of redirecting sensitive operational data through an external authorization channel that had never existed in previous versions. The code was elegant, subtle, and intentionally difficult to recognize. It did not look like an accident. It looked like something written by a person who understood exactly how engineers searched for mistakes. Malcolm leaned back in his chair without saying a word. Instead of raising an alarm immediately, he copied the affected files into an encrypted archive, recorded the exact timestamps, and documented every change inside his black notebook. Experience had taught him that facts mattered more than assumptions. Before accusing anyone, he wanted evidence that could survive every question. Later that afternoon, he walked into Graham Pierce's office carrying a printed report. Graham barely looked up from his tablet before accepting the papers. As his eyes moved across the highlighted sections, his expression remained surprisingly calm. He did not appear confused. He did not seem concerned. Instead, after several long seconds, he slowly placed the report on his desk and asked a question that instantly unsettled Malcolm. "Who else has seen this?" Malcolm answered honestly. "No one. I wanted to verify everything before involving additional people." Graham nodded almost with relief. "Good. Leave this with me. I will coordinate with executive leadership. We cannot afford unnecessary panic this close to the demonstration." Malcolm studied Graham's face for another moment. There was no urgency, no curiosity about how the unauthorized pathway had appeared, only a quiet determination to control who learned about it. Walking back toward the engineering department, Malcolm felt something he rarely experienced at work. Doubt, not about the data, about the people responsible for it. That evening, after dinner, Lila proudly showed him the latest version of her robotics project. The small machine rolled smoothly across the kitchen floor before stopping inches away from a chair leg. "I added another safety check," she said with a smile. "If the sensor reads something that does not make sense, it stops instead of pretending everything is fine." Malcolm smiled as he watched the little robot wait patiently for another command. "That is exactly what good systems should do," he replied. "A machine that refuses to stop when something feels wrong is not reliable. It is dangerous." While Lila carried the robot back to her room, Malcolm quietly folded a brand new cardboard box and slid it beneath his desk at home before placing a plain white envelope beside it. He still hoped he would never need either one, but something deep inside him whispered that the next few days would not be decided by engineering alone. The following morning, Malcolm arrived carrying the same calm expression he wore every day, but inside his backpack the encrypted archive and handwritten notes remained close at hand. He had spent most of the previous night reviewing every possible explanation for what he had discovered, hoping there was an innocent answer hidden somewhere inside thousands of lines of code. He found none. Instead, each new comparison pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. Someone with deep access to Sentinel had deliberately created a pathway that should never have existed. By mid-morning, the entire company had shifted into preparation mode for the federal demonstration scheduled later that week. Conference rooms filled with rehearsals. Marketing teams polished presentations. Engineers were instructed to avoid unnecessary changes so the platform would appear stable for visiting officials. From the outside, Aegis Dynamics looked like a company confidently approaching one of the biggest milestones in its history. Beneath the surface, Malcolm could feel invisible pressure building in every department. Shortly before noon, an executive assistant appeared beside his workstation. "The chief executive officer would like you in conference room 3. Malcolm quietly saved his work, locked his computer, and followed her upstairs. Inside the room, Victoria Langford stood beside a large digital display showing the final deployment schedule. Graham Pierce was already seated with several senior managers, his expression composed and welcoming enough to seem reassuring. Victoria began without wasting a single moment. "We are moving forward with the production release tomorrow evening. Every department has confirmed readiness." Malcolm waited until she finished before speaking. "I cannot confirm readiness." The room became noticeably quieter. Victoria turned toward him. "Explain." Malcolm connected his laptop to the display and carefully presented the hidden authorization pathway he had documented. He avoided speculation and focused only on verifiable facts, showing timestamps, code revisions, and system behavior that could not be explained by routine updates. Several engineers around the table exchanged uncertain glances as they followed his reasoning. For a brief moment, Victoria appeared genuinely interested. She stepped closer to the screen and studied the highlighted code without interrupting him. Before Malcolm reached his conclusion, Graham leaned forward in his chair. "Those revisions were already reviewed," he said smoothly. "Our outside consultants classified them as harmless optimization. We discussed this yesterday." Malcolm looked directly at him. "Then they missed something important." Graham responded with a patient smile. "Or perhaps you are overanalyzing normal development changes because you have been maintaining this platform for too long. Fresh eyes often see the bigger picture." Victoria folded her arms as she shifted her attention away from the monitor and back toward Malcolm. "Are you telling me that every independent reviewer is wrong?" Malcolm answered without raising his voice. "I am saying the data deserves an independent security investigation before we certify the release." Graham placed a neatly organized report in front of Victoria. This is the final assessment from 3 separate consulting teams. Every one of them recommends proceeding on schedule. Victoria opened the report and silently scanned several pages. She did not know that Malcolm had never seen this document before. She also did not know that key sections of his original findings were nowhere inside it. The warning had simply disappeared. Malcolm immediately recognized the missing pages. Someone had removed every reference to the unauthorized pathway before the report reached the executive office. He looked toward Graham, whose expression never changed. At that moment, Malcolm understood something far more troubling than a software problem. The system was not the only thing being carefully controlled. Information was too. As the meeting ended, Victoria instructed every department to prepare for deployment exactly as planned. Malcolm quietly gathered his notebook, but before leaving the room, he glanced once more at the presentation screen displaying the countdown to launch. The numbers continued moving toward 0 with perfect confidence. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering whether the greatest threat facing the company had nothing to do with technology at all. By the next afternoon, the atmosphere inside Aegis Dynamics had changed in subtle ways that only someone like Malcolm would notice. Conversations became shorter whenever he walked past. Managers who normally stopped by his workstation now relied on brief emails instead. Even Elena Brooks seemed unusually cautious as she approached his desk carrying a folder. She lowered her voice before speaking. Another executive meeting. They moved it to 4 o'clock. Everyone from senior leadership will be there. Malcolm thanked her with a quiet nod. He already knew why. His request for an independent security investigation had not disappeared. It had simply become inconvenient. At exactly 4 o'clock, the executive conference room filled once again. Victoria Langford stood at the front beside a large display showing the final authorization package for the Sentinel deployment. Graham Pierce distributed printed copies while projecting the confidence of a man who believed every detail had already been settled. Victoria looked around the room before speaking. This release determines the future of this company. Delays are no longer an option. She turned toward Malcolm. I understand you still have concerns. This is your opportunity to present them before we finalize today's decision. Malcolm stood without rushing. He connected his laptop, opened his documentation, and carefully explained the hidden authorization pathway one final time. He avoided dramatic language. He pointed only to facts, timestamps, and repeatable evidence. I cannot certify this release because I cannot verify where this pathway ultimately leads. Until that question is answered, signing this document would violate every engineering standard this company claims to uphold. Several department heads exchanged uneasy looks. One senior engineer quietly nodded while following the technical diagrams on the screen. Before anyone else could respond, Graham rose from his chair. We have spent millions of dollars on outside consultants, he said evenly. 3 independent firms reached the same conclusion. They found no meaningful security concern. We cannot keep delaying progress because one engineer refuses to trust the review process. Malcolm answered calmly. Independent reviews only matter if they receive complete information. Graham smiled politely. Or perhaps they simply reached a conclusion you do not like. Victoria stepped forward. The pressure of the coming federal demonstration, the expectations of the board, and weeks of relentless deadlines were all visible behind her controlled expression. Mr. Reed, she said, I have reviewed every report presented to me. I have listened to every argument. At some point, leadership requires a decision. Malcolm met her eyes without anger. Leadership also requires accountability. The room fell silent. Graham leaned toward the table and spoke before Victoria could answer. There is another issue worth mentioning. Mr. Reed has repeatedly requested schedule flexibility because of family obligations. He routinely leaves before most of his team. Perhaps his priorities have simply changed. A few uncomfortable faces lowered toward the conference table. Victoria looked back at Malcolm. Is that true? Malcolm did not hesitate. I leave on time to pick up my daughter. Then I continue working from home after she goes to sleep. Every system log will confirm that. Graham shrugged lightly. Commitment is not only measured by login records. Leadership requires presence. Malcolm's voice remained steady. My daughter is not evidence that I am less committed. She is the reason I refuse to sign my name beneath something I believe could place others at risk. The words lingered in the room longer than anyone expected. Victoria took a slow breath, then pushed the InSign certification across the table until it stopped directly in front of Malcolm. "Then I am giving you one final choice," she said quietly. "Sign the authorization and support this company, or leave it." Malcolm looked down at the document, then slowly reached beneath the conference table where a neatly folded cardboard box had been waiting all along. Without a single word of protest, he began placing the few personal belongings from his workspace inside it. And for the first time since Victoria had become chief executive officer, uncertainty quietly entered the room before anyone else realized what was happening. The elevator doors closed behind Malcolm without a single person calling him back. He stood quietly as the numbers descended from the 31st floor, his cardboard box resting comfortably against his arm, as though he had rehearsed this moment many times in his mind. When the doors opened into the lobby, the afternoon receptionist looked up with a surprised smile that quickly faded after noticing the employee badge lying inside the box. Malcolm simply wished her a good evening before walking through the revolving doors into the cool autumn air. Behind him, life inside Aegis Dynamics appeared to continue exactly as it always had. Meetings resumed, calendars filled with reminders. Executives reassured one another that the demonstration would proceed without interruption. Graham Pierce even joked that companies survive departures every day. "Nobody is bigger than the organization," he remarked while several managers forced polite laughter. Victoria said very little. She returned to her office, placed the sealed white envelope inside a desk drawer without opening it, and focused on preparing for the federal presentation. She told herself that difficult leadership sometimes required difficult decisions. Meanwhile, Malcolm drove directly to Jefferson Elementary School. Lila climbed into the truck carrying a small trophy from a classroom science challenge. Her smile faded when she noticed the cardboard box resting on the back seat. "Did you clean your office today?" she asked. Malcolm glanced at her through the rearview mirror and smiled gently. "Something like that." She studied his face for another moment before quietly fastening her seat belt. She had learned long ago that her father never hid the truth from her, but he always waited until the right moment to explain it. That evening they prepared homemade spaghetti together while talking about her upcoming robotics competition. Malcolm laughed as she explained why she had redesigned her emergency stop system for the third time. "If something behaves differently than expected," she said confidently, "the safest choice is to pause before making everything worse." Malcolm looked at her with unmistakable pride. That is a lesson many adults never learn. After Lila went to bed, he carried the cardboard box into a small room that doubled as both his home office and workshop. Instead of unpacking it, he placed it carefully on a shelf beside several old engineering textbooks. Then he opened his laptop and checked the public status page for Sentinel. Every indicator remained green. Every performance graph appeared flawless. Yet something felt strangely unnatural. He closed the browser without logging into any company systems. For the first time in 12 years, he no longer had permission to look behind the dashboard. Across town, inside the operations center at Aegis Dynamics, engineers began noticing small irregularities that individually seemed harmless. A routine synchronization task finished 12 seconds earlier than expected. A backup server reported 100% efficiency for nearly 6 consecutive hours, something that had never happened before. An automated diagnostic generated identical performance numbers 3 cycles in a row. Each anomaly was dismissed because every result appeared positive. Elena Brooks quietly remembered something Malcolm had once told a room full of junior engineers during a late-night maintenance session. "When the numbers become perfect," he had said, "stop trusting the numbers." Unable to shake the memory, she reopened one of Malcolm's archived technical notebooks that remained in the engineering reference library. Tucked between handwritten diagrams and system sketches, she found a single sentence underlined twice in black ink. "Perfect data is often the first symptom of hidden failure." Elena stared at the page for several long seconds before looking toward the glowing operations screens across the room. At that exact moment, one monitor briefly flickered before returning to normal. Nobody else seemed to notice. Somewhere deep inside the Sentinel network, invisible processes continued moving exactly as they had been designed to move, and for reasons no one yet understood, the system looked healthier than it had ever looked before. The morning of the federal demonstration arrived beneath clear skies and a level of confidence that seemed almost impossible to question. By 7 o'clock, every parking space around Aegis Dynamics headquarters was filled. Government representatives, aviation partners, and members of the board moved through the lobby while television crews assembled outside for what many believed would become one of the company's defining moments. Inside the operations center, enormous display walls glowed with flawless system statistics. Every graph climbed smoothly. Every response time exceeded expectations. Every executive congratulated one another before the presentation had even begun. Victoria Langford stood beside the demonstration stage, straightening the sleeve of her jacket as she quietly rehearsed her opening remarks. Graham Pierce leaned close enough for only her to hear. "Today changes everything," he said with complete confidence. "By this afternoon, the board will finally see that we delivered exactly what we promised." Victoria nodded, although something about the perfect numbers continued to bother her. She remembered Malcolm's steady voice explaining that systems rarely behaved perfectly. Before she could dwell on the thought, applause filled the room as the guests took their seats. The demonstration began exactly on schedule. Sentinel processed simulated air traffic across multiple regions with remarkable speed. Every command executed instantly. Every visual display earned approving whispers from the audience. Several government officials exchanged impressed smiles while engineers in the control room relaxed for the first time in days. Then one of the younger analysts quietly frowned at his monitor. He refreshed the incoming telemetry twice before raising his hand toward Elena Brooks. "These aircraft positions are repeating," he whispered. Elena stepped beside him and compared the live feed against archived data. The flight paths matched perfectly, down to the smallest timing intervals. That should have been impossible. She quickly opened another diagnostic window. The timestamps were current, but portions of the operational data were identical to recordings created nearly 3 weeks earlier. Before she could process what that meant, another alert appeared. An outbound authorization request had been initiated through a communication pathway no one in the control room recognized. Elena felt her heartbeat quicken. "This is not a live stream," she said quietly. "Something is replaying approved data while another process is running underneath it." At the front of the auditorium, the audience remained unaware that anything had changed. Victoria continued answering questions with professional confidence until one of the engineers rushed toward the stage carrying a tablet. She glanced at the screen and felt the color leave her face. "Pause the demonstration," she ordered immediately. Across the operations center, commands were entered to suspend the platform. Nothing happened. Another attempt produced the same result. Sentinel acknowledged every instruction but continued operating exactly as before. Graham stepped forward, forcing a reassuring smile. "Probably a temporary synchronization delay." Elena looked directly at him. "No, the control requests are being accepted, but they are not reaching the execution layer." The room became unnaturally quiet. Victoria turned toward Graham. "Can we isolate the system?" He hesitated for the first time. "We should be able to." "Should?" she repeated. No answer came. Elena suddenly remembered the white envelope Malcolm had placed on Victoria's desk 2 days earlier. "Did you ever open what he left you?" she asked. Victoria froze for one brief moment before turning and walking quickly toward her office. Her hands remained steady until she unlocked the drawer and lifted the unopened envelope into the light. She stared at Malcolm's careful handwriting across the front for several long seconds before slowly breaking the seal. Realizing that the quiet engineer everyone believed had walked away in defeat might have understood this day far better than anyone who had remained behind. Inside the envelope, Victoria found no letter of resignation and no accusation. Instead, she unfolded a carefully organized packet containing annotated system diagrams, archived security logs, documented code revisions, and a handwritten timeline that stretched back nearly 3 weeks. Every page was dated. Every observation was supported by evidence. At the very top of the first sheet, Malcolm had written a single sentence in neat block letters. "If you are reading this, the unauthorized pathway has already reached the execution layer. Do not waste time searching for a software failure. Search for the person who insisted nothing was wrong." Victoria turned the next page and felt her breathing slow. Malcolm had highlighted every occasion on which his reports had been altered before reaching executive review. Attached beside each entry was a copy of the original version he had personally archived. Entire sections warning about the hidden authorization pathway had disappeared from the reports she had approved. At the bottom of one page, another note appeared. I never asked you to trust me. I only asked you to verify the evidence. Back inside the operations center, Elena continued isolating data while engineers struggled to understand why every command seemed to disappear. Before reaching the core of Sentinel, Graham remained composed, insisting that the system only needed a controlled restart. Victoria walked back into the room, carrying the open envelope. Her eyes settled on Graham for several long seconds before she spoke. Who edited Malcolm's reports before they reached my office? Graham answered without hesitation. No one. Those were the complete reports. Victoria quietly laid the original copies beside the executive versions. The differences were impossible to ignore. Several senior managers immediately leaned forward, comparing page after page in stunned silence. Graham's confidence faded almost imperceptibly. There must be some misunderstanding, he said. Victoria did not respond. Instead, she looked toward Elena. Call Malcolm. Across town, Malcolm was sitting in the front row of Jefferson Elementary School's gymnasium, watching Lila make final adjustments to her robotics project before the state qualifying competition began. His phone vibrated once. He looked at the screen, saw Elena's name, and stepped quietly into the hallway before answering. Elena did not waste a single second. You were right, she said. The demonstration is compromised. We cannot stop the execution layer, and Victoria has finally opened the envelope. Malcolm closed his eyes briefly, not out of satisfaction, but out of disappointment that events had unfolded exactly as he feared. Is anyone hurt? He asked. No, Elena answered. But sensitive operational data is at risk, and nobody understands the pathway except you. Malcolm remained silent for a moment before speaking. Put the phone on speaker. Seconds later, Victoria's voice came through, noticeably different from the confident tone she had carried only hours earlier. Mr. Reed, I need your help. Malcolm answered calmly. You need the system protected. Those are not the same thing. The hallway became quiet except for distant sounds of children preparing for the competition. Victoria took a slow breath. You were telling the truth. The evidence was telling the truth, Malcolm corrected gently. I simply refused to sign something I knew had not been fully examined. Graham suddenly interrupted from somewhere in the background. We do not have time for this. He can explain everything after we regain control. Malcolm immediately recognized the urgency in Graham's voice. Do not let him direct the recovery, he said firmly. Disconnect his administrator credentials from the operations network and preserve every system log exactly as it exists right now. If anyone modifies those records, you will lose the evidence that explains how this happened. Silence followed. Then Victoria gave a clear instruction to the security team. Suspend Graham's access immediately and preserve every server log. For the first time that day, Graham stopped arguing. Malcolm looked through the gymnasium doors and watched Lila standing beside her small robot, patiently waiting for her turn. Then he spoke once more. I will help because innocent employees and customers should not pay for leadership failures. But I am not coming back to defend anyone's pride. I am coming back to protect the truth. He ended the call, knelt beside Lila as she adjusted the final sensor on her robot, and smiled. Remember what you told me, he said softly. The safest system is the one that knows when to stop. Lila smiled without realizing that her simple lesson had just become the principle that might save an entire company. Malcolm arrived at Aegis Dynamics less than 40 minutes later, but he did not walk through the front entrance as someone returning to reclaim a position. He entered through the operations center accompanied by Elena, carrying only his black notebook. The cardboard box remained at home. He greeted no executives and accepted no apologies. His attention went directly to the engineering displays, where dozens of anxious employees stepped aside without being asked. Malcolm studied the incoming data for less than 2 minutes before pointing toward one of the secondary authorization clusters. The execution layer is still accepting commands, he said calmly. It is rejecting only the source that has been compromised. Route every emergency instruction through the legacy verification channel. One engineer looked confused. That channel was retired years ago. Malcolm shook his head. It was never retired. It was hidden as a failsafe. He quickly outlined the recovery sequence while Elena coordinated the implementation. Within moments, the frozen command queue began responding. Unauthorized outbound requests stopped appearing. Archived logs were secured exactly as Malcolm had instructed. The demonstration remained suspended, but the system itself was finally under control. A wave of quiet relief moved through the room. No one applauded. The moment was too humbling for celebration. Victoria stood silently beside the main display, watching every instruction Malcolm gave. There was no anger in his voice, no desire to embarrass anyone, only the steady focus of someone protecting people who had trusted the company to do the right thing. As soon as the platform was stabilized, Malcolm closed his notebook. "Do not reconnect the external authorization pathway," he said. "The investigation needs an untouched record." Company security, following Victoria's direct order, completed the preservation of every server log and every administrative action connected to the deployment. Independent investigators later confirmed that the hidden pathway had been intentionally concealed through altered documentation and incomplete executive reports. Graham Pierce was removed from his position pending the outcome of a formal investigation, and the evidence showed a pattern of decisions that placed deadlines above transparency. During the following board meeting, Victoria did something few executives ever chose to do. She accepted responsibility publicly. Standing before employees from every department, she admitted that she had trusted summaries instead of evidence, authority instead of expertise, and assumptions instead of questions. She acknowledged that Malcolm had never asked for special treatment, only the opportunity to let the facts speak for themselves. Then she invited him to return as Chief Technology Officer. Malcolm thanked her for the offer, but quietly declined. "I never wanted a bigger title," he said. "I wanted a company where engineers could tell the truth without risking their careers." Several days later, the board approved the creation of an independent engineering integrity office with full authority to pause any deployment that failed safety review, regardless of deadlines or executive pressure. They asked Malcolm to lead it under one condition that he proposed himself. His work schedule would always allow him to pick up Lila from school. The board agreed without hesitation. Elena was promoted to Director of Systems Engineering because she had chosen evidence over convenience when it mattered most. Weeks later, at Lila's robotics competition, Malcolm sat in the front row exactly where he had promised he would be. Her small robot navigated the course with confidence until it detected an unexpected obstacle. Instead of forcing its way forward, it stopped, recalculated, and safely found another path. The judges smiled before announcing that Lila had earned first place for designing the most reliable system, not the fastest one. After the ceremony, Victoria quietly approached them without assistants or reporters. She congratulated Lila first, then turned to Malcolm. "I judged your priorities without understanding them," she said sincerely. "I thought leaving on time meant you cared less. Now I understand it meant you knew what mattered most." Malcolm smiled gently. Success is never measured by how long someone stays at work. It is measured by the decisions they are willing to stand behind when nobody else agrees. As they walked toward the parking lot, Lila slipped her small trophy into her backpack and looked up at her father. "Dad, was packing that box the hardest thing you ever did?" Malcolm thought for a moment before answering. "No. The hardest thing was refusing to abandon my principles when it would have been easier to stay silent." Lila nodded as though the answer made perfect sense. The evening sun settled behind the school, and father and daughter walked to their truck together, carrying nothing more valuable than trust, dignity, and the quiet certainty that real strength is not proven by winning arguments or holding powerful titles. It is proven by telling the truth, protecting others, and having the courage to walk away from the wrong path until the right one finally has room to be heard.